March 2008. A satellite truck idles outside a modest brick sanctuary on the south side of Chicago. Then another. And another. By the end of the week, there are dozens of them, cables snaking across the parking lot like veins, reporters doing stand-ups in front of a church most of America had never heard of 2 weeks earlier. Inside that building, a congregation of roughly 8,500 people is trying to hold a Bible study. The phones don't stop ringing. Some of the calls are reporters, some of them are threats. This is Trinity United Church of Christ. And the man who built it, a fiery, brilliant, controversial preacher named Jeremiah Wright, has just become, overnight, one of the most talked about religious figures in American history. Not because of a scandal inside his church, because a few seconds of sermon audio, clipped and looped on cable news, collided with the presidential campaign of one of his most famous members, a young senator named Barack Obama. Everyone remembers what happened to Wright's national reputation in the spring of 2008. Fewer people ever found out what happened next to the church itself. What happened to the 8,000 people who still had to show up on Sunday morning after the cameras packed up? What happened to the young pastor who inherited the pulpit in the middle of the worst media storm a black church had faced in a generation? Did Trinity collapse the way so many predicted, or did it do something nobody expected? Stick around, because the real story of Trinity UCC isn't about 2008. It's about everything that came after, and it's a story about what institutions do when the world stops watching but the work doesn't stop. To understand what happened to Trinity, you have to understand the timing, because the timing is almost unbelievable. Jeremiah Wright had spent 36 years building Trinity from a struggling congregation of a few dozen members into one of the largest, most influential churches in the United Church of Christ denomination. A church with its own credit union, its own senior housing, dozens of ministries, and a theological identity summed up in 5 words: unashamedly black and unapologetically Christian. By the mid-2000s, Wright was preparing to retire, and like a lot of long-tenured pastors building a legacy, he handpicked his successor years in advance. That successor was a younger minister named Otis Moss III, a Yale-educated preacher with deep roots in the civil rights tradition. Moss's own father, Otis Moss Jr., had marched with Martin Luther King. The younger Moss came to Trinity in 2006 as an assistant pastor, groomed to eventually take the pulpit. Nobody in that arrangement could have predicted what was about to happen. By 2008, Moss had already begun taking on more and more of the regular preaching duties as Wright prepared to step back. And that is precisely the moment the sermon clips broke. Obama was in the middle of a presidential primary. Wright's most incendiary lines, pulled from years of sermons, stripped of context, replayed on a loop, became a 24-hour news story. Bomb threats were called into the church. National camera crews staked out the building. Members who had worshipped there quietly for decades suddenly found their church's name trending on cable news chyrons. And Otis Moss III, barely into the job, was standing in the middle of it. He later admitted, in interviews years afterward, that the pressure was disorienting enough that he questioned whether he'd taken on the right assignment at all. Imagine stepping into the biggest job of your career and, within months, having your building surrounded by media trucks and your inbox full of threats aimed at a controversy you didn't create. But here's the part of the story that almost never gets told. The transition itself got messy too, according to later reporting on the church's internal transition. The succession plan didn't proceed as smoothly as it had been laid out. In the middle of 2008, with national scrutiny at its peak, there was friction over exactly what authority Moss actually held. At one point, arrangements were floated that would have effectively kept Moss in a subordinate role rather than full senior pastor, even though he had already been functioning as the church's primary preacher. It was, by any account, an awkward and tense period for a church that was simultaneously trying to survive a 5-alarm public relations crisis and sort out its own internal chain of command. Moss stayed the course. And in May of 2009, more than a year after the scandal broke, he was formally and fully installed as Trinity's senior pastor, no longer assuming responsibility, no longer in an ambiguous in-between status, but officially in the chair Wright had occupied for 36 years. Think about what that year in between actually looked like on the ground. A congregation trying to worship normally while satellite trucks camped outside. A new pastor navigating a leadership structure that hadn't fully resolved itself. A founding pastor stepping back from a legacy he'd spent his entire adult life building. In the least graceful exit imaginable. Not a retirement tour, but a national controversy. That's the version of the Trinity story most people never heard, because by the time Moss was formally installed in 2009, the cable news cameras had already moved on to the next controversy. The country's attention span had run out. Trinity's work, the actual, unglamorous work of being a church, was just getting started. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. How do you lead a church that just became a symbol for something it never asked to represent? Jeremiah Wright's preaching style was, by design, confrontational. It was rooted in the Black prophetic tradition. The kind of preaching that names injustice directly, that doesn't soften the edges, that treats the pulpit as a place for righteous anger as much as comfort. That style built Trinity into a spiritual and political force on the South Side for decades. It's also exactly the style that, clipped into 15-second sound bites without context, became a national controversy. Otis Moss III inherited the theology but changed the delivery. He didn't renounce Trinity's foundational identity. The unashamedly Black and unapologetically Christian motto stayed exactly where it was, carved into the church's self-understanding. But where Wright's sermons often landed like thunder, Moss built a reputation for something quieter, intellectual depth, poetic cadence, and notably for a mainline Protestant pulpit. An openness to hip-hop as a legitimate cultural and theological language rather than something to be preached against. Moss has talked in later interviews about preaching what he calls a blue note theology, borrowing the idea from jazz and blues where the note that sounds slightly off against the chord is actually where the emotional truth of the music lives. It's a preaching style built for grief, resilience, and hope held together at the same time, rather than pure confrontation. That shift mattered enormously for how Trinity was perceived from the outside. For a couple of years, Trinity United Church of Christ was, in the public imagination, shorthand for a single controversy, a place defined entirely by 15 seconds of tape. Moss's preaching style, over time, helped pull the church's public identity back toward what its members had always known it to be. Not a political flashpoint, but a community institution, a place for baptisms and funerals, food pantries and Bible study, choir rehearsal on Tuesday nights and Sunday school on Sunday mornings. The theology didn't move. The temperature did. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because this is the part almost nobody outside Chicago heard about. Instead of playing defense forever, Trinity under Moss expanded what activism at the church actually looked like, pushing into territory that Wright's generation of civil rights preaching hadn't fully claimed. The first big pivot was environmental justice. This is a framework that treats pollution, industrial waste, and climate impact as civil rights issues. Because in city after city, it's low-income Black and brown neighborhoods that end up next to the refineries, the landfills, the highways. Moss leaned into that connection hard. Trinity installed large-scale solar arrays on its property, turning the church itself into a working example of the sustainability it was preaching about. And the church built something called the George Washington Carver Community Garden, named after the agricultural scientist and inventor, to teach neighborhood youth how to grow food, understand food security, and reconnect with land in a city where grocery deserts are a real and documented problem on the South Side. It's a strikingly practical form of ministry. Not a sermon about food insecurity, an actual garden where kids learn to grow the food. The second big pivot was media. This is arguably where Moss's fingerprint on Trinity is most distinct from Wright's era. Moss founded something called the Unashamed Media Group, built directly out of the church, with a mission to produce and distribute content, films, sermons, music, storytelling, rooted in Black theology and justice. It's worth pausing on how forward-thinking that move actually was. In an era when a lot of legacy churches were still debating whether to live-stream services at all, Trinity was building an actual production arm, treating digital storytelling as a ministry in its own right rather than an afterthought. One of the clearest examples, Moss produced a short film about his own grandfather's failed attempt to vote in 1946, a personal family story turned into a piece of public history, using exactly the kind of media-savvy approach that Wright's generation of preachers never had access to. Put those two pivots together, environmental justice and digital media, and you get a church that didn't just survive its worst year. It used the aftermath to reinvent what activism meant inside its own walls. Less about a single fiery sermon going viral for the wrong reasons, more about tangible, sustained infrastructure, solar panels, garden beds, film production, ongoing platforms rather than one-off moments. That's not a retreat from Trinity's activist Dina. It's an evolution of it. Let's address the elephant in the room because it's the question everyone actually wants answered. Did Trinity collapse? In 2008, the predictions were dire. Obama himself, under enormous political pressure, publicly and formally cut ties with the church he had belonged to for 2 decades, the same church where he'd been married and where his daughters had been baptized. When the most famous member in your congregation's history publicly walks away, and your founding pastor becomes a symbol of controversy, and your name is being shouted on cable news by people who've never set foot in your sanctuary, the reasonable prediction is this church doesn't make it. Some members did leave during the height of the chaos. That's real, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. A congregation that size, going through that level of sustained national scrutiny, was never going to come out completely unchanged. But the mass exodus that a lot of outside observers expected simply didn't materialize at the scale predicted. What actually happened looks a lot more like institutional loyalty than institutional collapse. The people who had been baptized at Trinity, buried family members from Trinity, built their social and spiritual lives around Trinity for years or decades. A lot of them stayed. The congregation didn't need Barack Obama to remain a multi-thousand-member flagship church. It needed its own members, most of whom had joined for reasons that had nothing to do with presidential politics in the first place. Trinity today remains one of the largest and most influential congregations in the entire United Church of Christ denomination, a mainline Protestant body that includes thousands of churches across the country. That's not a church that quietly faded into irrelevance after a scandal. That's a church that weathered the single worst media crisis a congregation can face and came out the other side still standing as an institutional heavyweight. The lesson embedded in that survival story is worth sitting with. National media attention and actual institutional health are not the same thing. Trinity's crisis was almost entirely externally generated, driven by presidential politics, not by anything happening inside the church's own ministry. And because the crisis was external, the church's internal foundation, decades of community trust, mutual aid, and relationship, was strong enough to hold once the cameras left. So what actually happened to the man at the center of the original storm? After stepping back, Wright was given the title of Pastor Emeritus, an honorific that formally recognized his 36 years building the church, even as day-to-day leadership passed fully to Moss. Trinity's congregation, in a gesture that speaks to how much loyalty Wright still commanded inside the church even after the national controversy, built him a retirement home in Tinley Park, a Chicago suburb. For several years after 2008, Wright remained a respected, if lower-profile, figure, still preaching occasionally, still deeply tied to the institution he built, but no longer at the center of its daily operations or its public identity. Then, in September of 2016, Wright suffered a major stroke. It left the left side of his body paralyzed and left him reliant on a wheelchair, and it affected his voice as well. It was a serious medical event, and by every account, it significantly reduced both his public profile and his physical capacity in the years that followed. He has continued to appear at events and occasionally preach in the years since, including a notable return to Howard University's Rankin Chapel, a tradition tied to his name for decades, but always now from a wheelchair, with a voice that carries the visible toll of what he went through. It's a genuinely poignant coda to the story. The man whose 15 seconds of sermon audio became a national flashpoint spent the years afterward largely out of the spotlight, dealing with a serious health crisis, while the institution he spent 36 years building kept running, under new leadership, with a new public voice, but still standing on the foundation he laid. Trinity, for its part, has continued to treat Wright with the respect due a founding figure, someone whose 36 years of work is baked into the church's DNA, whatever the national media cycle around him looked like in 2008. So, what really happened to Trinity United Church of Christ after Jeremiah Wright? The honest answer is almost anticlimactic compared to the media firestorm that preceded it. The church did the hard, unglamorous work of institutional survival. It navigated a genuinely rocky leadership transition, one complicated by ambiguous authority, internal tension, and the worst possible timing imaginable. It found a new preacher whose style was different enough to change the church's public temperature without abandoning its theological core. It took its activist tradition and pointed it at new frontiers, solar panels and community gardens, film production and digital storytelling, rather than trying to relive 2008 forever. And it held on to enough of its membership and enough of its institutional identity to remain one of the most significant congregations in its entire denomination. There's a broader lesson buried in this story, and it's not really about religion or politics specifically. It's about what happens to any institution, a church, a company, a family, when it gets defined publicly by its worst 15 seconds and then has to figure out who it actually is once the world stops watching. Trinity's answer was, keep showing up. Keep the garden growing. Keep the solar panels running. Keep the choir rehearsing on Tuesday nights. Let the work outlast the headline. Jeremiah Wright built the foundation. Otis Moss III built on top of it in a different key for a different era. And the congregation, the 8,000-plus people who never asked to be a national news story in the first place, is the reason there was anything left to build on at all. If you found this deep dive into Trinity's actual story valuable, subscribe for more deep dives into the real, complicated aftermath of America's biggest media storms, the parts of the story that happen after the cameras leave. And let us know in the comments, what other institution do you want us to trace the afterstory of next?